So, Mr. Smith, how did you get to know Congresswoman Brown?
Well, I actually met her the day that she retained me. There's a mutual friend who understood that she was looking for an attorney. And so they contacted me, they being her daughter and the Congresswoman. I went up to Jacksonville, had a conversation with her, and she ended up signing me as her attorney that day.
So, was Chantel Brown the mutual friend?
That's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
So, have you worked with her in lobbying circles, or is she?
I have not. And actually, when I say the mutual friend, the person was actually Natalie Jackson, who knows Chantel Brown. So
Okay.
I didn't know Chantel, nor did I know the Congresswoman, but Chantel knew Natalie. And Natalie told her, if you're looking for someone who's very good and has experience in federal criminal law, James Smith would be the person you want to talk to.
So, you're Congresswoman Brown's fourth attorney. Do you find working on this case with her difficult?
Not at all, not at all. You know, the one thing that you find when you work with her is this is someone who's a very dedicated public servant. The first day after she signed me and I started working with her, it was difficult to walk maybe 5 or 10 minutes without coming into contact with a constituent who had some story about how she had influenced their life in a positive way. So, not at all. All of our conversations have always been very good, very productive. The one thing that impresses me about her is that she really, truly loved being a public servant.
Mm-hmm. We did see in one of the attorneys that didn't pan out. There was a lot of conversation of a conflict of interest and a hostile work environment. Do you have in any way a hostile work environment with the Congresswoman?
No, not at all, not at all. And if I did, obviously I wouldn't be able to be on the case. You know, my relationship with her so far has been great, and I expect that it will be the entire time that I represent her.
Does she understand the gravity of the charges against her?
Absolutely. I don't think that you can't understand the gravity of the charges when you're indicted and you have to go to federal court. I've been doing this now for over 21 years, and I can tell you that anytime someone ends up going to court, they quickly realize the gravity of the situation. The important thing about her, though, is that she's continued to do her job. Even though she's no longer going to be a member of Congress at the end of this term, she still shows up for votes. She's still doing constituent service. So what's really impressed me is the fact that she's dealing with the weight of these serious criminal charges, and yet she's still doing her job as a member of Congress.
How devastating was it for her to lose that primary?
I think it's incredibly devastating, and I just have to believe that the timing of the indictment had something to do with it. You know, people are unfortunately naturally cynical about politicians, their elected representatives, and so if you're in a tight primary, it obviously is going to have an effect on your ability to get reelected if you're being indicted or under investigation. So I think it was devastating for her, but the reason it's devastating is because she loves doing what she does. This is a woman who has always fought for her constituents. I can give you a little anecdote. We were at the Congressional Black Caucus weekend breakfast, and you know, I at that point had known her for about 10 days or so. And you can see from time to time the stress of this is wearing down on her. But one of her former interns was on the stage. He was now working in Congress, and her eyes just lit up. This is someone who takes pleasure in seeing how she can help someone and how that help over time improves their lives.
So how do you think it's going to affect her mentally and physically to have a change of routine now? The fact that she's not going back to D.C. and instead facing a federal trial next year.
Well, the one thing that she realizes now is that she has a new battle. You know, the one thing that she always saw herself as is a public servant who was fighting for her constituents. Well, now she's fighting for herself. Her full-time job used to be being in Congress, and now, from the end of her term until we go to trial, her full-time job is going to be regaining her good name, fighting for her reputation, and frankly, fighting for her freedom.
Are you confident you're going to be able to give her that freedom?
Absolutely. Now, I can't promise or guarantee any result, and every attorney would tell you that that's something that we can't do. But what I can guarantee you is that I'm going to bring all the experience that I have to the table. I'm going to give 100% of my effort. And the most important thing I think I'd like to do here today is clear up some of the misconceptions that are out there, some of the things that have been in the press about the case and the evidence in the case.
So what is it about your experience that you feel like makes you the right fit for this defense team?
Well, I got my career, started off in the United States Army as a JAG officer. And I tell any young law student, if you're thinking about going into trial work, the United States military is the best place to go. I did hundreds of trials while I was in the JAG Corps, and that trial experience, I think, really helped me become the lawyer that I am today. After my time in the JAG Corps, I then went on, I taught law school for a few years, then I was at the Federal Public Defender's Office, where I gained a lot of experience doing the type of case that the Congresswoman is facing. So I think it's the teaching, the trial experience, and the military experience. Those are all the things that help me be uniquely suited to defend her.
Okay, so moving forward to the defense, Can you tell us at all how you see her defense argument shaping at this point?
Really going to rest on three principles. And first and foremost, it's going to be her character and her reputation. One of the things that you can admit in courts is what's known as character testimony. This is someone who has almost 40 years of faithful, dedicated service, and I'm certain we're going to have a number of people who will be able to come into court and talk about her character for honesty and truthfulness. The second pillar is really going to be pointing out the fact that the government's case is very circumstantial and that there's little, if any, direct evidence which points to her guilt. The government's case primarily rests upon the testimony of someone who is admitted in court to being a liar, to being a thief, and who has admitted that she had no direct relationship whatsoever with the Congresswoman. And I think the final thing is I just really believe in the common sense of the average American juror. One of the things that's impressed me during my time doing criminal trial work is at the end of the day, when you have 12 citizens who sit down, they bring their common sense, good hard work, and good values. And I have to believe that if they take all those things and they look at the evidence, they're going to return a finding of not guilty.
So based on what you know about this case, do you firmly believe that Carla Wiley was operating this entire scheme absent of Congresswoman Brown?
All the evidence that I have strongly suggests that. There's three things to remember. Number one, the Congresswoman had no involvement whatsoever with the establishment of the charity that's at issue here. The second thing that's important to remember is that you've seen a figure that's been thrown around a lot, $800,000. Well, that figure, you have to compare it to the amount that the government's alleging actually went to the Congresswoman. And then last but not least, I think you just have to look at the Congresswoman and what she does for a living. This is someone who's incredibly busy. If you've ever had the opportunity to look at the day-to-day life of a congressperson, from the time they get up until the time they go to bed, which is usually late at night, they're doing one thing. Their job is a public servant. So the idea that Congresswoman Corrine Brown had any time whatsoever to engage in a conspiracy or a fraud, it just doesn't match with everything that people know about her and what I've seen thus far.
Do you feel like she just unknowingly trusted the wrong people?
That's what the evidence really shows. You know, when you are someone who's in a position of power and you have perks of office, unfortunately there are times when people can get close to you and they try to take advantage of those perks of office. One of the things that people should know is that Carla Wiley has entered a plea of guilty, and she has a plea agreement that's a matter of public record. And in that plea agreement, all right, she admits that she was the person who set up this charity, and she admits that she used some of the initial proceeds for her own personal use. But unfortunately, what typically happens is when people get caught, they realize that they can help themselves by trying to point the finger at someone else. And frankly, it's just a more interesting and sexier story for there to be a congressperson who's involved in misconduct as opposed to someone who's just up in the Washington, D.C. area who got caught with her hand in the cookie jar.
So you think Carla Wiley is throwing Congresswoman Brown under the bus to save herself?
Everything that I've seen thus far strongly suggests that.
Is there anyone else in the indictment that you believe was involved in the conspiracy other than Congresswoman Brown?
You know, right now, my focus is just on Carla Wiley because this is a person who's admitted that she's engaged in wrongdoing. It's also important to understand what the charges are in this particular case. The charges really fall into two categories my client's facing. The first are wire fraud charges. And so what those charges allege is that my client essentially engaged in fraud when she communicated with people to try to raise money for charitable purposes. There's no evidence that I've been able to see thus far that she did anything like that. Frankly, this looks to be a case of guilt by association. The second set of charges are tax charges, and we're confident that once we present our evidence to the jury, that she'll be acquitted of those as well.
But isn't it suspicious that Corrine Brown would make payments on days or a few days after certain amounts from one door would be deposited directly into her account?
Well, if your foundation is that Corrine Brown made these payments, then I can understand the suspicion that some people might have. But let's just say that once the evidence gets to court, I think you'll see that like most people who have high-powered jobs and positions, they rarely, if ever, are engaging in the day-to-day management of their financial affairs.
How dangerous do you feel like it is right now that the public is making assumptions on this case based on the information in the public arena?
Well, it's incredibly dangerous because if you think about it, people pay close attention to politics, they pay close attention to news. I'm sure they follow your news shows, your news organizations. And so if we have several months of stories getting out there, they tend to become firmly embedded in the mind of potential jurors. And so that's why it's going to be very important for prosecution attorneys and myself to make certain that we seek jurors who are willing and able to have an open mind about the facts of this case.
So if someone was sitting down to watch this story, what is the first thing you want them to hear from you?
The first thing I want them to hear is just remember, the greatest defense is your reputation. This is someone, again, who has a long record of faithful public service at the state, local, and federal level, and who's never been suspected of engaging in any type of misconduct. If you look at public officials who ultimately get accused of things like this, there's usually some indication in their past. There's usually some smoke which will show where the fire is. This is the first time there's ever been any indication of this whatsoever. I think it's also important to look clearly at the indictment and to see that some of the statements that have been reported in the press don't actually match what the Congresswoman's accused of doing.
Doesn't Congresswoman Brown also have a history of some bad financial decisions, though?
Well, let me put it to you this way. If we're going to prosecute people who make bad financial decisions, we probably would not have a number of people in elective office. There are probably a number of people who would be prosecuted. The issue here in this case is not making bad financial decisions. The issue is, did Congresswoman Brown engage in a deliberate conspiracy to defraud individuals? And I think the answer to that is no.
The federal government believes they have a very strong case against the Congresswoman. So obviously you two are not seeing eye to eye here. Do you feel like this is an overreach on their part?
Well, I have to say that I have no reason to believe that there's any bad faith on the part of the prosecutors. I know some of the people on the prosecution team. I know that they're officers of the court, and I have to believe that they're going where they believe the evidence has led them. But the great thing about our country is that ultimately you can't be convicted or found guilty until a jury says that you are in fact guilty. The other thing is they don't have the advantage of having some access to information that we have. Once we get to trial, we're confident that once the jury sees that information, they're going to find that Congresswoman Brown was a victim of circumstance rather than someone who committed a crime.
Now, how would it be possible that you all would have evidence that the prosecution hasn't seen yet?
Well, there are rules of discovery and disclosure that require us to turn over certain things. But if you think about just sort of the way that a basic case proceeds, the defense obviously is going to engage in an investigation and try to come up with information on its own. So it's not as if there's any hiding of the ball or withholding things. We fully intend to and have and will comply with all our discovery obligations. But I'm sure you can understand that there are things that the prosecution wouldn't necessarily have access to just because of our adversarial system. In other words, there are things that they're entitled to have, there are things that we're entitled to have.
So could there be new financial documents that could help to clear the Congresswoman's name?
Potentially. Potentially. You know, right now one of the things that I'm doing, there's literally tens of thousands upon tens of thousands of pages of documents that I'm in the process of going through. But I can tell you that one of the things that really impressed me, you know, after the Congresswoman selected me to be her lawyer and I was with her at the Congressional Black Caucus weekend, I can't tell you how many members of Congress, both sides of the aisle, Republican and Democrat, came up and said, I believe in you, I'm praying for you, and I really know that you're going to get through this. Knowing how sensitive politicians are to their reputations and being tied to people, I'd find it hard to believe that they would be saying that if they believed that she would be capable of doing something like this.
Also, there's been much said that only one $1,000 scholarship was ever given, but I've heard from other sources that more than 20 students were sent to China.
And that's part of what I was referring to earlier, which is you have to understand the threshold for charging someone in federal court is relatively low. All right, there are different standards of proof. The standard of proof in order to have a case actually brought forward to trial is just a very simple, low standard, which is, do we have probable cause to believe that the person engaged in a crime? And you've heard the old phrase that a grand jury would indict a ham sandwich. Well, I'm not saying anything bad about the grand jury in this case, but the one thing that it's significant is the difference between a grand jury and a regular jury. A grand jury is not an adversarial process. Defendants don't have the right to present their own evidence, to have their attorneys appear, and so as a result, grand jurors get a one-sided view of the evidence. You know, it's interesting, if we decided to change our grand jury system, I'd be curious to see how many cases ended up not actually making their way to trial. In order for Congresswoman Brown to be found guilty at trial, she's going to have to be proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the highest standard that we have in our criminal justice system. Just because she's indicted, that simply means that a grand jury said, we believe there's probable cause. The question that still remains to be resolved when we go to trial, is she guilty beyond a reasonable doubt?
Most cases end up with a plea deal because defendants don't want to take their risk at trial against the feds.
That
But
is
you're willing to take that risk?
Well, understand ultimately it's Congresswoman Brown's decision as to whether or not she wants to go to trial. She's maintained her innocence and intends to go and take the case to trial. When I first started in the federal system, was certainly familiar with the stats about their success rate, but I've had a few cases where the jury has come back and has returned a finding of not guilty. Again, the great thing about our system, and I truly do believe this, when you have 12 citizens, they tend to be very independent. The great thing, if you've never had a chance to see it, is how jurors, at the end of the day, they'll simply listen to the facts. They don't pay attention to who the lawyers are. They pay attention to the facts and the law, and they take great pride in that duty because they know that it's one of the few times in our system where people can stand up to the government and say no if they believe that someone's truly innocent.
Is she scared right now?
Well, I think she has all the normal range of emotions that people will have when facing something like this, but the most important thing I can say about her is she's determined and she's resolute. One of the things that I had the chance to experience with her the last time we met was the opening of the new African American History and Culture Museum up in Washington, D.C. And just to see the excitement and the pride, realizing that she was a member of Congress and had an opportunity to see something like this take place, she's moving on with her life. She realizes that she can't, sit down and have a pity party. She's strong, she's resolute, and she's ready to fight.
Do you think Ronnie Simmons' name will also be cleared?
Well, let me just say this. Mr. Simmons has an attorney. He's pleaded not guilty. And the one thing that I can say is that there's only one person who's admitted to any wrongdoing, and that's Ms. Wiley. As far as what's going to happen with Mr. Simmons, I think I'll have to leave that up to him and his attorney to comment.
How often are you in communication with Congresswoman Brown?
Pretty much every day, if not every other day. A typical case like this, obviously there's a lot of work that has to be done. And so, I try to do with her like I would with any client, which is to maintain regular contact. And if there's anything significant that happens, I'll update her and let her know.
Is she in daily communication with Ronnie Simmons still?
Well, I know obviously that he is still her chief of staff. So as far as whether or not they have daily communication about this case, I can't comment on that, but I can tell you that they still have an office that they have to run. They still have constituents they have to take care of. And so I'm pretty certain that they communicate about that.
Any signs yet to you that one of them may flip on the other in this case?
No, not at all. I think right now the pleas that have been entered in court are pleas of not guilty. And it's my understanding from everything that I've seen publicly that Mr. Simmons says that he's not guilty of this as well. And I know certainly my client says the same thing. Understand, it's incredibly easy to be accused of something. It's incredibly easy to accuse someone of something. Again, when you're a person who's in a position of power, it's very easy for people to take advantage of you. Sadly, sometimes the more powerful you are, the more vulnerable you are.
But we know Ronnie Simmons and Carla Wiley dated. We also know Corrine Brown loved Ronnie like a son. He'd been in her family for decades. How can you get someone to believe that Corrine Brown wouldn't know what was happening with Carla Wiley? And potentially Ronnie Simmons.
Well, I think what you do is you just tell people to use their common sense and their knowledge of the ways of the world. Just imagine, for example, a CEO of a major company. People wouldn't believe that that CEO is going to be involved in the day-to-day minutiae and details of the handling of the finances. Well, a congressperson is just like that CEO. When you're a congressperson, your basic task is to represent your constituents. And so the idea that a woman who represents literally one of the largest congressional districts in the state would be involved in the day-to-day operations of a charity which, and this is established on the record, she didn't establish, well, that just simply doesn't make sense. So, in other words, to summarize my answer, is it possible that a congressperson could be taken advantage of by someone? Absolutely, easily.
So 77,000 pages of discovery, that's the number we heard. How much of that do you think you've been through at this point?
A fair portion of it, more than half. A lot of it, obviously I can't discuss because we have a disclosure order which says that we can't discuss the nature of it to the media. But this is a paper case. And so when I say a paper case, what I mean is this is a case that the government is going to try to make based upon showing documents and various transactions. But, I really think at the end of the day, this case is going to come down to, again, and I have to emphasize this, her reputation and her good record, and the fact that it's incredibly easy to be taken advantage of if you're a member of Congress. Just like athletes or entertainers, members of Congress unfortunately sometimes attract people who want to take advantage of the perks of their office.
Is Corrine Brown going to take the stand?
That's a decision that we'll certainly have to make. I'm not going to make any news here, at least on that particular issue. But I always tell all my clients, even if you don't take the stand, you still testify. And by testifying, what I mean is the jurors look at you from the moment they come in. They look at the way that you carry yourself, how you conduct yourself in trial, and you also testify based upon the reputation that you bring into the courtroom. So by that standard, by that measure, she's certainly going to have at least one leg up once the trial starts.
Because you feel like jurors are empathetic to her?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think once jurors really sit down and are educated about what a congressperson does and what she's done, they're going to realize that there's no reason to have the automatic assumption that many of us tend to have about public officials. In other words, that they tend to be corrupt.
So is Corrine Brown corrupt?
Oh, absolutely not. Absolutely not. In no way, shape, form, or fashion. This is someone who's been reelected time and time again. The one thing that's impressed me about her is she's like an old retail politician. She's not someone who sits in an office and just makes fundraising phone calls all the time. She's someone who literally day to day gets out there and meets with her constituents. I'll tell you about one example in particular. The day that I came on the team to represent her, we were at a local restaurant, and there was a gentleman who walked up to her and he said, "Listen, I just want to thank you so much for everything you've done for the unions. I work in one of the trades here, and what you've done for me has really dramatically improved my life." And it brought her to tears. And she turned to me and she said, "You know, this is why I've been fighting for so long. I don't do it because of the money. I don't do it for fame. I do it for exactly that reason, so that people can feel like I've made a positive impact in their lives."
Do you think someone other than Carla Wiley within Corrine Brown's inner circle took advantage of her?
That's possible. You know, I don't know exactly who yet, and as the evidence develops, perhaps we'll see. But the most important thing is this. Is there any evidence to suggest that the Congresswoman sat down and sent letters or emails or phone calls or looked at people face to face and said, "I need for you to give me money so that I can use it for charity," when she really secretly was thinking that she was going to use it for her own personal gain? And I think the answer to that is no. That's the burden that the government has. They're accusing her of wire fraud, which requires that she have a specific intent, and that is to defraud people by making materially false statements. And I think the evidence clearly doesn't support that.
So you think there's a big absence of a smoking gun to prove that?
Absolutely. The only way to prove that, at least in my mind, is for the government to say to the jury, "You have to believe Miss Wiley." But that's very difficult. That's very tricky. How do you convince a jury to believe someone who's admitted to being a liar?
But on on the front of Corrine Brown and fundraising, we have a flyer where she is inviting people to the Corrine Brown Invitational Golf Tournament in support of raising money for One Door for Education. I mean, is that not a smoking gun?
Well, it depends on how you view that evidence, all right? Who prepared that flyer? Was she aware of the preparation of that flyer? And at the time when that flyer was made, was there a truthful intent to raise funds? Understand here, the crime is not running a charity in a sloppy way. The crime is not putting on a golf tournament that doesn't raise sufficient funds. The alleged crime is, did you lie to people in order to induce them to give money so you could use it for your own personal gain? So if there was a golf tournament that wasn't run effectively, that's not a crime.
How much of Corrine Brown's life has changed here? I mean, we know that Vaughn Alexander was her right-hand man. She's in the indictment. We know Chantrell Brown, her daughter, she's in the indictment. Also, Ronnie Simmons' sister, Monica Simmons-Isom, she's in the indictment. You know, persons A, B, and C. Plus, Ronnie and she are sitting here indicted together. I mean, this is her entire inner circle tied up in this case.
Right, but understand, that's all based upon documents and the testimony of Miss Wiley. There's an old saying which is, if you give a prosecutor enough time, they can make things look suspicious. But suspicion doesn't equate to guilt. And again, the great thing about our system is that the government, within the boundaries of the law, does have the right to conduct an investigation and to charge someone, but that evidence has the right to be tested by the defendant. And so, I want to take you back, I'm probably dating myself here, but there was a former labor secretary, I believe, who worked in the Reagan administration, Secretary Donovan, and he was accused of corruption, was tried by the federal authorities, and was acquitted. And when he walked out, there was a reporter who came up to him, and the reporter said, "So, you have your freedom back?" He's like, "Yeah, but can you tell me now, or I can go back and get my good name?" That's probably how her life has changed the most. She gets acquitted of this, and I strongly believe that that's going to be the case. The reality is that unfortunately there may still be some people who believe there must have been something there. We tend to, in the American society, believe that if someone is charged, they must have done something. And so that's the biggest concern that she has and that I have for her, which is she gets acquitted. Hopefully people will realize that she didn't get acquitted on a technicality or she didn't escape. She got acquitted because the evidence shows that she's innocent. And hopefully she'll be able to get her reputation back.
That's a bigger concern than possibly her being convicted and going to prison?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a bigger concern, but when you fought so hard for people, most people would say that the one thing that they value, in addition to their freedom, is a good name and good reputation. Because you could be acquitted, but there may still be whispers out there that, you know what, there must have been something there.
Do you think it's likely at all we could see Corrine Brown go to prison over this?
Well, prison is a possibility. We try not to focus in on that because our focus is on trying to provide a strong and vigorous defense. But anytime someone is facing the possibility of a trial, the possibility of prison time is something that's present. She knows that, she's aware of that, obviously I'm aware of that, and my goal is to make certain that that doesn't happen.
How heavy does this weigh on you?
Well, you know, this weighs on me heavily, but it weighs on me heavily for any client, you know, that I represent. When you're a criminal defense attorney, one of the things that you realize is that you are, right, the one person that stands between your client and the weight of, be it a state prosecutor or a federal prosecutor. But rather than worrying about it or getting stressed out, what you try to do is pour all of your positive energy into putting forth a good defense, always being honest and forthright with your client about the chances of success, and making certain that the day of trial, you know the facts of the case cold, you know the law, and you're prepared to go in and argue passionately.
How many hours a week are you spending on this case?
Oh, I guess probably a better question would be how many hours a week am I not spending on the case? A lot. You know, a lot. I mean, to quantify it would be really hard, but I can tell you I think about it literally from the time that I get up until the time that I go to bed.
How many hours did you say you work on it a day?
Oh, I'd say probably 10 to 12 hours a day.
So is this your sole focus right now?
I have other cases, but I have primarily turned most of my attention now to this case. I have an associate that I work with, and I've given her most of the responsibility for the other cases because this is a very big case. The United States has 3 attorneys who are at the table who are going to be doing the trial. I'll have myself and my associate who will be doing the trial, so I do really focus on this. This is the primary focus right now, yes.
Mm-hmm. Do you still think we're set to go forward in February?
I think so. You know, one of the great things about the federal system is that it's very efficient and judges try to make certain that cases move along. The good thing about the judge that we have and the system that we have is that there's a good exchange of documents beforehand, so there are no issues. Usually if there are delays in cases, those delays are going to be for significant reasons. For example, the unavailability of a witness, or there's just some significant scheduling issue that the judge can't resolve. But I would anticipate that at the latest, March or April of next year, this case will have gone to trial.
How long do you think the trial will take?
My experience, you're talking about literally several dozen witnesses, lots of paper and documents. This is a trial that could probably go on for about a month. I know the longest trial that I had in federal court lasted for 9 weeks several years ago here in Orlando. The one thing that's probably going to take a long time with a trial like this is finding a juror that can sit down and can say, I can be fair and impartial. Everyone knows who Congresswoman Brown is, and by the time we get to trial, they will have heard a number of things about the case. People who are involved in politics have very strong opinions, and so it's probably going to take us some time to find jurors who can be seated and who can give her and Mr. Simmons a fair trial.
Is it possible to find those impartial jurors in Jacksonville?
It is. It is. I really do think so. I know that sometimes the issue comes up about a change of venue, but the reality is it'd be hard to find a place in Florida where she isn't well known. You know, this is something that's received national coverage. So I do believe it's possible. If I didn't, then we'd perhaps have a motion to try to change venue.
Do you think she and Ronnie Simmons will be tried together?
As of right now, that's the plan, yes.
But is that in your best interest, or is it in your better interest to separate the cases?
Well, there are times when it's in the best interest to have people tried together because you may have a joint defense. You know, in this instance, I know Mr. Simmons has entered a plea of not guilty, and we have as well. And so there may be some joint defense strategies that we could employ here.
Okay, so beyond this being on Carla Wiley, are there any other scenarios or strategies you'd be willing to discuss with us?
Not at this time.
Is there anything else you think the public needs to know about Corrine Brown's involvement in this case?
I guess what I would say to members of the public is keep an open mind. You know, the most important thing that we have to remember in our democracy is that this could happen to anyone. One of the things that I've talked to some of my law students about is the documentary that came out last year called Making a Murderer. And the reason I think that's such an important documentary is because it shows just how easy it is to be convicted in our system. If the weight of the United States government or a prosecutor's office presses down on you, people are automatically going to assume that you've done something. That's just human nature. But if you know anything about history, you know anything about the law, almost every week there are individuals who are released from prison because evidence has shown later on that they're innocent. If you truly believe in the legal system, if you truly believe in democracy, what you'll say is let's keep an open mind, let's wait and see what all the evidence is that is introduced at trial, and let's trust that the jury, which is a fundamental bedrock of our democratic system, will do the right thing.
Corrine Brown has repeatedly said that this case is a witch hunt. Do you think this was a witch hunt?
Well, I can understand why she would feel that way if you have to think about some of the things that she's encountered politically over the past few years. First and foremost, you had the effort to change her congressional district and change it in a very fundamental way, which I think fairly could be viewed as an attempt to make it harder for her to be reelected. And then you also look at the timing of the investigation and the indictment as well, right in the middle of a very hotly contested primary. So it's natural for someone who's had her experience to view it as a witch hunt. I think it's also important too to put it in some historical context. She's an African American member of Congress. There was an article that came out in the Atlantic magazine back in 2012 which talked about the disproportionate number of ethics investigations and criminal prosecutions of African American members of Congress. Now, am I saying that this prosecution was motivated by race or politics? No. What I am saying is it's important to understand her history and the things that she's seen and why it might cause her to make a statement like that.
But you don't think this case has been motivated by race?
What I'm going to do is focus in on this, the evidence in the case, and trying to make certain that I provide her with a very strong defense. Do I believe that she was charged because of her race? I have no reason to believe that. What I do have a reason to believe is that she was charged because the government unfortunately has relied upon the testimony of someone who can't be trusted, and that once we go to trial, we'll be able to demonstrate that to a jury.
Are you going to put Carla Wiley on the stand?
Well, that's not up to us. It's my understanding that the government is going to list her as a witness, and so I believe in order to prove its case, the government would have to call her as a witness, and we certainly intend to subject her, like we would to any government witness, to a vigorous and thorough cross-examination.
We understand this was a very long grand jury process, somewhere between 6, 12, and 18 months. Do you feel like there were intentional and purposeful leaks from the grand jury process to the public?
Well, let me just say this. This wouldn't be the first time that things made their way out into the public that should have been kept secret. And all I can hope is that from this point forward, things that are supposed to remain private will remain private.
And you didn't oppose this protective order against the evidence?
No, not at all, not at all. And the protective order is there for good reason. There's information which could, if disclosed to the public, compromise individuals' identities, and there's sensitive information. So, you know, I'm a big believer in the idea that my job as a lawyer is not just to reflexively oppose things. My job is always to advise my client on what I think the best course of action is, and that's why we didn't oppose the protective order here.
Okay. Is there anything else you feel like we need to discuss?
Just want to thank you for giving us an opportunity to talk to members of the public, and let me just say this. You know, I frequently get asked questions about my job as a criminal defense attorney, and people, they say, well, how can you represent people who have done bad things? I represent people who are accused of things, and that's a significant difference. It's up to the jury to decide whether or not a crime was committed here. I firmly believe that once a jury sees all the evidence, they're going to find that Congresswoman Brown is who she's always maintained she is, a good, faithful public servant who was simply taken advantage of by people.
Is this the most complex case of your career thus far?
You know, you might think that, given the fact that it's someone who's a member of Congress and you have a lot of documents, but I've had cases which have been on a smaller scale, and I've represented people who perhaps were not as prominent, and those cases have been more complex. What I always try to tell my students is something I learned in my first year as an Army lawyer. To each and every client, that case is a significant and the most important event in their life, and that's how I try to treat those cases.
So how would you surmise this case in one sentence for us?
I guess I would surmise this case in one sentence by saying this is a case about a woman who has a record of decades of good, faithful public service who was taken advantage of by someone who wanted to use the perks of her office.
So you think this was perks of the office, the blinded by the big lights of D.C.?
Absolutely. I mean, this wouldn't be the first time that people in Washington, D.C. saw an opportunity to take advantage of someone who's in office.